Welcome to our first Cities at Tufts virtual colloquium of 2026. I'm Professor Julian Adjerman, and together with my research assistants Ainsley Judge and Max Sebar, and our partners Shareable and the Bar Foundation, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognises Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we're delighted to host Dr. Karen Jacobsen, who is the Henry J. Lear Professor in Global Migration at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy here at Tufts University. Her research explores urban displacement and global migration, especially the livelihoods and financial resilience of migrants and refugees, and on climate and environment-related mobility. She directs the Refugees in Towns project at the Lear Institute for Migration and Human Security here at Tufts. In 2013-14, she was on leave from Tufts, leading the joint IDP profiling service at the United Nations in Geneva. From 2000 to 2005, she directed the Alchemy Project, which explored the use of microfinance to support people in refugee camps. Her latest book, Host Cities, How Refugees Are Transforming the World's Urban Settings, examines the impact of displacement on cities. And of course, Karen's talk today is called Host Cities, How Refugees Are Transforming the World's Urban Settings. Karen, a Zoom-tastic welcome to Cities at Tufts. You're on mute, Karen. Tom, can you unmute Karen, please?
Okay, we're good. We're live. Hi, welcome. Thank you. All right, is it over to me?
We're ready, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you all about my new book. I started this book quite a long time ago, about 5 years ago. The reason that I wanted to look at host cities is because I've been working in the field of refugees and forced migration for many years. And during that time, I had pretty much worked in refugee camps and explored what happens to people in camps. But I was noticing over the years that more and more people, refugees, were coming to cities. And although there has been an increase in interest on the part of academics and researchers and advocacy people over the years about what happens to people in cities, there had been not that much research done. Gradually it was increasing, but certainly there hadn't been much research done on what happens to the cities themselves and to the people in them when a large mass influx of refugees or internally displaced people comes to a city. So I was interested in trying to understand how cities are transformed. And it seemed to me there were two types of cities that were important to distinguish. One is smaller cities, particularly those that are near borders, or secondary cities as we think of them. And the other are the huge capitals that we see in the so-called developing countries. I don't like the term the global south, but countries of Asia and Africa and Middle East, Latin America, where very large cities are increasingly growing as a result of urbanization and also as a result of displaced people coming to them. So in my book, I focus on two cities. One is Lebanon's second city, which is called Tripoli. It's in the north, and it's quite near the border of Syria. And between 2012 and pretty much last year, 2 years ago, well over 1 million refugees came from Syria, from the war in Syria, to Lebanon. Lebanon is a very small country, population of about 5 million. To have more than 1 million, it was more like 1.5 million people come to Lebanon, had a massive impact on Lebanon in general. And many of those refugees came to the cities of Lebanon. So I chose Tripoli because that was quite representative of cities that were near the border and had very substantial numbers come to them. The second city that I chose was a megalopolis, the giant capital of Egypt, Cairo, which has been experiencing refugee flows and movements through it and into it for at least the past 40 years. But had a very significant flow also coming from the Syrian conflict beginning in 2012. So I was focusing on these two cities, but before I get into them a bit, I just want to say that I argue in the book that it's important to understand why the difference between refugees who come to a city and ordinary so-called the usual urban migration that we see that is so typical of the world today. I argue that the appearance of refugees or other displaced people, the flow of them into the city, is different for 4 reasons, different from migrants. The first reason is that when we see a humanitarian influx, the number and intensity of refugees coming is often very great, much greater than normal so-called normal urbanization, where people are coming in over, sort of gradually. We often see, in many cities, we've seen thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people arriving in a city over the course of a few months. And then those numbers may increase. And generally, sometimes the flow can be sustained for several months, and then it may continue. In the case of Lebanon, that flow continued for many years, as with Egypt. So one reason is the city is experiencing basically a population shock, and the city has to respond, as we'll talk about. A second difference between refugees and other kinds of migrants is that refugees when they come, they are followed by what we call the humanitarian industry. So the humanitarian industry are the humanitarian agencies, like the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations like the International Rescue Committee or Médecins Sans Frontières, or Oxfam, and so forth. Large international NGOs that are extremely well funded, often more well funded than the governments they come to. And of course, UN agencies, multilateral organizations like the UN or the International Committee of the Red Cross, even the World Bank. And these organizations are charged with assisting and helping refugees and providing protection to them. And of course, these organizations are supplemented by other national NGOs that are also concerned with refugees. This kind of industry, this kind of humanitarian industry, does not appear for migrants. When migrants come to cities, they receive very little help, very little international help and assistance. And so that's a very significant consequence for cities, because although most of the assistance is aimed at refugees, in fact, the cities benefit in quite substantial ways that we'll talk about later, because there's a spillover effect from how the resources and funds that come into the city to help refugees are also going to benefit often city governments and municipalities, but also the local population living in cities. So then a third difference between refugees and migrants is the case of refugee camps. So not all countries hosting refugees, not all of them require refugees to live in camps. In fact, only about half of the world's host countries do require refugees to live in camps. But when they do require refugees to live in camps, those camps are often built or established quite near cities. And one of the things that I look at in the book is how the presence of a refugee camp near a city has significant consequences for the city. Because most refugee camps are open. I mean, you might have to, they sort of monitor the entrance and exit from them, but most people can move in and out of refugee camps. And so people use the cities. They come to the cities, refugees come to the cities, and people from the cities come to the camps. They may come for trade, they may come for business, they may come to use some of the services in the camps, like the schools. They may even try to come to gain access to humanitarian assistance. So there's an exchange and a movement between camps and cities, which again has significant consequences for the city. So those are at least three differences. And a fourth one between migrants and refugees concerns the response and attitudes of the people living in the city to the refugees, which is different from that response and attitude toward migrants. So one of the things that I explore in the book is what determines this response. Most of the times in cities or anywhere, when refugees appear and come seeking asylum and seeking safety, people are relatively welcoming toward them, sympathetic. They offer assistance. They sometimes even open their homes to them, and they seek to help them. This is not the case for migrants. People are much less sympathetic toward migrants and much more likely to view them as competitors for their jobs, or just generally less sympathetic toward them. But what's really important is if we look at this attitude of local people, host population toward refugees, that attitude changes over time. It may start off as being positive and welcoming, but the longer refugees stay and the more of them that come, the less welcoming that attitude becomes. And this trend is well established historically. It began back in the 18th century with the first refugee camps that were set up in England, in London, on the banks of the Thames. Initially, people were very welcoming, and the Queen herself, who was welcoming refugees, provided assistance to them. But over time, as more and more refugees, these were the Huguenots fleeing the religious wars in Europe in the early 18th century, as more and more of them came, people became much less welcoming. And we've seen this trend establish itself in countries all over the world. So what's interesting is how that attitude, whether and how that attitude changes in a particular city. Because one thing that's clear is the response of people, of the host population, to refugees is not the same throughout a single country. Even here in the US, it's very clear that some places, some areas, some states, some cities are much more welcoming toward refugees than others are. And why is that? So one of the things I explore is one of the things I am arguing is that it depends on the history and experience of the cities themselves and what has happened to them. In the case of Lebanon had gone through its own civil war for many years, and many of the people in the cities of Lebanon have themselves been displaced because of that war. And so the experience of displacement itself can often make people much more sympathetic toward refugees. So, and also can make the city government more hospitable, more welcoming of refugees. So, but these attitudes are very different when it comes to migrants. So these are at least four differences that I think are really important, and is why I think it's important to understand the impact of refugees on cities as a phenomenon. And you know, doing research over the years, nobody seems to have done this. There are some individual case studies of cities that have looked at what happens in the city, but there hasn't been any real attempt to systematize the study, and especially not to compare different cities. So that's what I set out to do in this book. And I wanted to look at how what happens to the city, right? When in the presence of a large number of refugees and in the presence of this large humanitarian industry that comes with them. So the book is divided into these two cases. The one is Tripoli in Lebanon, and the other one is Cairo. And in each city, I look at different pieces of the picture. For example, in Lebanon, I look at the impact on the urban environment, and particularly the problem of sanitation and how cities deal with the increased burden on sanitation services. The book is not entirely positive on what happens, because one of the things that we know is that when refugees come from conflict zones, they may often bring aspects of that conflict with them. And so that can create security problems for cities, as indeed has been the case in the city of Tripoli, where different factions from the war in Syria became involved with various factions in the city of Tripoli and created quite a few problems for Tripoli. This has also been the case historically in Lebanon with Palestinian refugees who came from Jordan to Lebanon in 1970, and there have been also created security problems for Lebanon at that time. So I look at some of the security issues, some of the social cohesion and conflict issues that arise in cities when refugees come. But I also look at the economic impact of refugees on cities, including the impact of illicit markets. So one of the things that also happens when refugees move around is increasingly the only way people can move is by being smuggled. Today, if you are desperately trying to escape a war, be it in Sudan or Ethiopia or the cartel wars in Latin America, the only way you're able to move now, because of the way that many countries have barricaded their borders and created visa regimes. So the only way you can move is to pay a smuggler. So I was interested to try to understand what role smuggling plays in the economies of cities that are heavily affected by people wanting to move on. Because one of the things that happens in Lebanon is that many people from Syria did not want to stay in Lebanon. They wanted to move on to Europe, to other countries. But to do that, they had to hire smugglers. They also had to hire smugglers after Lebanon closed its border with Syria. And in late 2012, 2013. And so in order for Syrians to get to Lebanon in the first place, they had to hire smugglers to come across the mountains into Lebanon. So the smuggling industry boomed in Lebanon over the years of the war in Syria. And it seemed to me that boom certainly has knock-on economic effects in the cities. But it's a very difficult issue to study. And it's not easy to go and to find smugglers and talk to them and to find out about who's being employed by smugglers and how much money they're making and how this money is being utilized, how the money is being, where the money is going, where it's very difficult to make these, to be talking to smugglers. So that was a chapter that the chapter was speculative in some ways, but trying to draw on as much research as possible in other ways where I couldn't myself go and talk to smugglers in Lebanon. So in Lebanon also we looked at Well, so let me turn to Cairo. In Cairo, we looked at different aspects of the impact of refugees. Again, we were looking mainly at Syrians because they were the largest number, but there are also very substantial numbers of other refugees in Syria, in Cairo, sorry, including large numbers of Sudanese people who'd been there a long time since since before South Sudan became independent in 2012. But also there were new flows of Sudanese since the war in Sudan that began in 2023. However, I did not go up to that period. I was mainly looking at the period between 2012 and 2020. And so there were many refugees who'd been there many years. There were many Ethiopians and Eritreans and many Iraqis who had come from a much earlier period. So Cairo was characterized by different refugee groups with different experiences. And I was trying to understand how those experiences played out in Cairo. So one of the arguments that I make in the book is that when refugees come to a city, as is the case with migrants, they don't distribute themselves evenly throughout the city. They tend to go to different neighborhoods, often where their previous co-nationals have moved. So, we have the phenomenon of Chinatowns and Koreatowns here. Similarly, in many host cities in other countries, people congregate or become concentrated in certain neighborhoods where their co-nationals live. In the case of Cairo, it's interesting because Cairo, the Egyptian government had been trying to develop what it calls its new cities, its desert cities, for many years. And one of these desert cities is called 6 October, named after a battle with the Israelis back in the day. And this city is about 25 kilometers from downtown Cairo, linked by a highway through the desert. And into this city, many have moved many Syrian refugees, to the point where some of the districts within 6 October city are dominated by Syrians, and they have really provided a stimulus to the economy there. They've brought with them their own businesses, they've brought investment funds, and they have really provided a significant increase into economic activity and to business activity, entrepreneurship in these areas. So one of the pieces that I look at a lot in Cairo is how refugee entrepreneurs that have come over to Cairo and have decided to stay, not just in Cairo, but in other cities in Egypt too. There are many cases of where particular industries, like for example the textile industry in some of the desert cities, has been boosted by the arrival of Syrians Syrian refugees. Another chapter on Egypt in Cairo looks at the remittance industry. So this is looking at how refugees and migrants too, but especially refugees, all migrants need channels to remit their funds, to move money around, because refugees and migrants, for the most part, have a lot of difficulty. It's often impossible to open a bank account. To open a bank account, you need proper documentation, you need a permanent address, you need to have all of your papers in order. And for many migrants and refugees, it's not possible. Banks don't want migrants and refugees to open bank accounts with them because they're not a stable population and they're not known to banks. So it's impossible to not only open a bank account, but also impossible to send money through usual institutions like Western Union, because Western Union also requires this documentation and proof of residence and so forth. And so what we have seen is the emergence of informal money transfer systems throughout developing countries, but particularly in countries that are conflict affected, and particularly in situations where refugees and migrants need to send money, which is all the time. So what's called the hawala system is an informal money transfer system, how people send remittances. And I was interested in Cairo to look at how the presence of this industry, this informal money transfer industry, what impact it's had on the city. Again, this is a very under-researched area. There's been a lot of research on remittances themselves, but not on how the remittance economy, what impact that economy has on a city. So it's, again, one of the problems I ran into this book is just there's actually a dearth of research and information about the impact on cities of these things like remittance, the remittance industry or the smuggling industry and so forth. So finally, let me just say that so other chapters that I look at in the book on Cairo is to look at the impact on social cohesion of these neighborhoods to which refugees move. And one of the things that I looked at is how one problem that emerges often is that women have a lot of trouble. Women refugees have a lot of trouble because of the association they have that the neighborhood attributes to them with their men folk, who can often create problems. So what we're seeing in some areas, in some neighborhoods of Cairo, is that young men, especially from Eritrea or in some cases South Sudan or Sudan, who are unlike who do drink alcohol and find ways to drink alcohol or create lots of problems in some of the neighborhoods they go to where alcohol is, of course, forbidden. And so we've seen a lot of tensions emerge in some of these neighborhoods and women being blamed for some of these problems. So I was looking at how these problems play out and also what neighborhoods do to try to address some of these problems, to try to reduce conflict in the neighborhood between refugees and non-refugee and local people. So that's another piece of the social cohesion and how refugees influence social cohesion for good and for bad. And in many of these cities, there's both security problems and social cohesion problems that we can identify across, in many cases. The book focuses on Cairo and on Tripoli, but I draw many comparisons with other cities in Africa, particularly, and in the Middle East, where I've worked over the years or am familiar with. I'm myself from Africa. And for example, I look a lot at Kampala, which is the capital of Uganda, and look where I've worked for quite a while, and looking at the impact there, comparing how informal settlement areas where refugees and migrants live really struggle with the issue of waste disposal and sanitation services. And many other cities in Africa face these same problems that I explore in the book. So that's what the book's about, looking at these different issues: environmental impact, economic impact. I look at housing issues. And then I look particularly at what happens when the humanitarian industry arrives, the kinds of funds that flow into these cities from, for example, UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees office, which is in charge of refugees. And for just even a simple example is that when UNHCR comes to a city, they have to set up a large compound that can where refugees are being processed, warehouses to store food. And so all of these things cost money, and the UN agencies like the World Food Program and UNHCR pay the city, often they pay the city government directly. to rent office space, to rent land where the warehouses are. So the municipalities can get direct funds for themselves from benefiting from the presence of these agencies needing to have office space and warehouse space. In addition, the presence of these agencies means that they provide a lot of employment locally. They provide employment for a range of services, ranging from drivers and security guards and janitors, all the way up to interpreters and to office management. And so there's, working for the UN is a highly valued occupation, and it provides extremely well-paid jobs. And so this is another boon for the city when refugees come, along with the humanitarian industry. So these are just some of the chapters in the book, some of the issues that I've been exploring, trying to show how Cairo and Tripoli are representative of many, many other host cities in the world. And I haven't even talked about the presence of refugee camps, but yeah, that's a big issue in many countries too. I'll be happy to take any questions that you have, or I could talk some more, especially about what it means for our own country.
That was fantastic, really inspiring talk. And what does it mean for our country? I mean, obviously, your examples seem to be largely from outside the Western world. I did drop in the chat a really interesting piece by a woman called Professor Claire Rishbeth at Sheffield University in the UK. They've done this project in their landscape design department, Refugees Welcome in Parks, because obviously healing spaces are very important for refugees. So I've got so many questions. Number one, what are the implications for our country? Number two, does the sanctuary city idea just apply to migrants, or does it apply to refugees as well? Yeah.
Okay.
Talk.
Yeah. So sanctuary cities here in the US and elsewhere. Okay. What happens in sanctuary cities is cities declare themselves to be safe spaces for migrants and refugees. That is for people are usually already present in the country, and maybe, for example, now we're seeing maybe, trying to escape ICE, say. But it's not exactly the same thing. I mean, because a sanctuary city is offering some relative safety to refugees. So yeah. But what I'm interested more in is what happens when those refugees are in the city and living there, and what kind of impact do they have on the city? Sanctuary cities don't necessarily mean that more people will go to them. They are usually providing support for people who are already in them, although it may have an attraction effect, but for the most part, so I'm more interested in, I would say that my book doesn't have much to do with sanctuary cities. There are cities out there who have got hundreds of thousands of refugees. One thing I did not mention, which is really important, is that in trying to understand the impact on the landscape of cities. What we're seeing is that cities, especially in the global south, so-called, are growing phenomenally, and we all know that. All cities are growing. In the south, in poor countries, those cities are growing through informal settlements that occur on the edges of cities and pushing cities' footprint out. But they're also occurring within cities. So, for example, in Kampala, the informal settlements that we worked in, including with your colleague Justin Hollander, he and I were co-PIs on this project. We are seeing informal settlements within Kampala, right up against even the formal central business district. And it is these informal settlements into which refugees and migrants tend to go because these areas are cheaper, it's easier to find housing, you can find informal work there, and you can escape the gaze of the state gaze for the most part. So it's important to understand what's happening in these informal settlements in these slum areas. Now, to your question about what does this mean for cities in rich countries? We think of ourselves as being so different, as being rich, which we are. And our cities are hundreds of times richer than the countries who are really experiencing refugee flows. But these similar dynamics are in place. And one of the things is that the neighborhoods into which refugees move, okay, we don't have huge informal settlements, but we do have, areas of concentration where migrants and refugees live, Koreatowns and Chinatowns and so forth. Even here in Boston, Brazilians live in Everett, and people go to places where their other co-nationals are. When it's refugees and migrants that come, especially in our current context, where people are really under strain and really experiencing a lot of difficulties about just trying to survive here, and not to be deported or to be caught up with ICE. What's really interesting to me, what I found that was so interesting in the other countries and that I think is relevant here, is that there is so much sympathy toward refugees. Perhaps not so much toward migrants, but certainly people don't always distinguish between them fully. And people living in these neighborhoods, be it their own co-nationals or not co-nationals, for example, American citizens here in the US, who are not from the countries these people are coming from, those Americans and host populations in general are willing to help refugees. It doesn't even have to be in a sanctuary city. It can be in a red state. It can be in a state where the governor has been very opposed to refugees. Within different cities and towns, people are extremely supportive and helpful, and that has been very inspiring to me. And I think it's a widespread pattern.
Right.
I'll
Okay.
stop on that yeah.
Great. Okay. We're getting several questions coming in. Have you seen a difference in how climate refugees are treated / welcomed versus refugees fleeing conflict?
Well, first of all, I must tell you that as my class can attest, I teach a course on climate and migration. And as my class will tell you, I really am opposed to this idea of climate refugees. There's no such thing as a climate refugee. There are people who migrate perhaps because of climate, but why people migrate is extremely complicated, and it's rare that people are moving only because of climate change. However, I'll give you the idea that people are moving because of climate change. Those people tend to be migrants, not refugees. Refugees are people who are fleeing persecution and conflict. The climate does not persecute anybody and does not it might create conflict, but then people are fleeing conflict, not the climate. And so when people come to cities, when people are displaced by events like disasters that are climate related, when they come to cities, if they are fleeing from a disaster like a hurricane or a flood or an earthquake, something like that, then they will be welcomed in the same way that refugees are. When they're fleeing from drought that has destroyed their crops and their land and are just coming, they're treated as migrants. So I think you can really distinguish disaster victims from other kinds of climate related migrants. It's complicated, but I do see that difference.
Okay. I think there might be some pushback from some people on that,
I'm sure.
but hey,
I'm happy
absolutely.
to engage. Yeah.
Another question. Do you have examples in Tripoli, Cairo, or elsewhere of city level policies that are welcoming for refugees and that could be replicated in other cities?
Yeah, that's a really important issue. I will give you some example. I would say that in Cairo and in Lebanon, we have to distinguish between the national government's response and the city government's response. In both of those countries, a national government was pretty much, the response was extremely passive. They did not require refugees to live in camps, so that was a good thing. But there were also many problems with not being willing to do anything for refugees, except unless UNHCR was doing it, right? So in those cases where national governments are very passive and not doing anything, or if they're not deporting or rounding up people, then we really look to see how the cities are reacting to them, are responding to them. And in most cases, the cities didn't do much of anything. I mean, occasionally would deport people, and in some ways that's fine. I think one argument that I make is that one of the best things you can do for refugees and migrants in cities is just to leave them alone. If you can not harass them and not treat them badly and just let them get on with their lives, what we will find is that people really are able to manage and to find a way to survive, in part because of the assistance they get from the host population. This is not a refugee camp situation where people need food and need things to be brought to them to survive. When people come to cities, they can especially living in informal settlements, they can generally find ways to survive if they are not being harassed by the state. Now, this brings me to positive policies as opposed to passive policies, but positive policies where the state has really tried to support. And I find, there are many, we can find some in the Refugees in Towns project that Julian referred to, where we try to document how cities have responded to refugees. But one of the best examples here in the US is the city of Denver in Colorado. Denver's two mayors in the last few years, along with the municipality of Denver, have been extremely supportive toward refugees, including those who are bused to them from Texas back a couple of years ago. The city has, the municipality and the mayor has worked with employers in the city to find ways to put refugees and migrants into apprentice programs that can help funnel them into jobs when they eventually become documented. As you know, when people are permitted to come into the US, they usually have to wait for a long period of time before they get their day in court, in immigration court. And during that time, which can often be 2 years because of the backlog in the asylum process, during that time they're not permitted to work. And so it's difficult to find a job. But what Denver did was to find a way to work through this by allowing them to become apprenticed, and which kind of set them up and worked in favor of both the private sector, and many businesses in Denver participated in this program. So this is an example of where the city is trying to work with the private sector to enable people to work and to provide for themselves, even if it just is in the form of an apprenticeship. And there are many such examples, and some of them I document in the book, but these are the things we need to look out for. Similarly with housing, there are many examples of how cities have tried to work with UN agencies and landlords to support refugee and migrant housing in some cities.
Great. Okay. Another question. You mentioned the distinction between male and female refugees and how women may be unfairly affected by some men's behavior. I'm wondering if you've come across implications for youth and their access to school, play spaces, and other resources.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I had a chapter that I had to jettison from my book, so I refer to it obliquely, but I was looking at the problems of children in Cairo in particular. And one of the issues that has emerged in Cairo that has created problems for refugees and neighborhoods is the emergence of street gangs. I would say that, the literature and research, it's not my area, but I understand that it's well known that young children and youth join street gangs for protection and to gain some kind of status or for various reasons. But it is also the case that street gangs have emerged in Cairo over the years and in many other cities. And sometimes they are, based on or the membership is from migrants and refugees. This is definitely a problem that we need to understand. But for younger children going to schools, and the whole issue of refugee schools in cities is really an interesting issue, because what we've seen, and one of the main people that I interviewed in my book in Tripoli was a Syrian refugee school teacher who came to Tripoli and was appalled at the status of schools, primary schools in Lebanon. And so he and some others started their own refugee schools. These became so successful that Lebanese people themselves wanted to put their children in these schools rather than in Lebanese schools. And we've seen this phenomenon throughout in many cities, including in Cairo, where the refugees themselves start their own schools, in part because their children have a lot of trouble in the national schools. Often there's bullying, there's racism toward Black African children, say, for example, in Cairo. And children have a lot of trouble in these schools. And so refugees start their own schools, which become very successful. Often there's, not always, but they can be supported by the humanitarian industry. And so these are really good examples of how refugees can have this really positive impact on the neighborhoods in which they live.
Mm.
I mean, I could say more, but that's a really good, interesting avenue to go down, the education.
Really, really impressive, isn't it? And it makes me think, where could this go? You could imagine maybe the refugees are people with more wherewithal to get out of the conflict zone. So maybe you're already selecting for a kind of elite group of people.
Yes,
Maybe some of them are teachers and doctors and
exactly.
things like that. But um, but they're going into a municipality. Um, where could this go? You could imagine, hundreds of thousands of refugees in a city that was only hundreds of thousands of people. So the city could become almost like a refugee majority city. What would that look like?
Yeah, and there are some cities, especially smaller towns,
Yeah,
where the refugees have become, the predominant population. This is not necessarily a good thing because people can become very resistant to it,
yeah,
especially is the case with neighborhoods. So, for example, in Tripoli, one of the oldest neighborhoods around the old souk in Tripoli was a long-standing, neighborhood. And then Syrians came in, and Syrians were regarded by Lebanese as being much more conservative. Okay, much more religious, much more conservative in their traditions. I mean, Lebanese are pretty much a sort of liberal-minded, kind of looser kind of people, let's say. Horrible to generalize like that, but still. And so the Syrians coming in were regarded as having a very sort of dampening effect on the neighborhood, and that led some people to move out, right? So there was this movement of Lebanese people moving out and ceding the neighborhood to these refugees. So there are negative effects as well. I'm not saying that everything is, wonderful that happens in the city. But to your point, I mean, especially in a city like 6 October outside of Cairo, that city has really, some of the neighborhoods has been transformed by the presence of refugee entrepreneurs who have come and started massive, for example, a huge food emporia that just because Syria is very famous for its food and cuisine, and especially in the Middle East, is widely loved. Syrian cuisine is loved. I mean, I think it's the most fabulous food. And so there have been super successful restaurants, chains that have been just brought over from Syria. And that's just one example of many entrepreneurial kind of enterprises that refugees have brought. It's a huge city, Cairo. And as I say in the book, when you walk around the streets of Cairo, you do not see, it's not clear that there are many refugees there, but they are in the neighborhoods once you go into these neighborhoods. So it's this neighborhood effect that is really important to understand.
Thinking of so-called Western countries, or municipalities in Western countries like Denver, who's seen as leaders in refugee, let's use the word integration or
Mm.
acceptance.
Mhm.
Is there one or two countries or municipalities that are leading the way?
Oh, this is such a vexed question, because even this term integration is very
Ex-
unpopular. You do not
Exactly.
use this.
Sure.
And certainly the countries that are most affected by it don't want to know about refugee integration. They want to see refugees as people, and they want to present them as people who are here temporarily and
Yeah.
will go back in time. So it's really tricky to talk to even to do that, and we are seeing from Lebanon, we're seeing many Syrians go back to Syria now that there's peace. Um, but for people who are like, the difference with in the US is that people who are here in the US now, who are not asylum seekers are different from refugees. Asylum seekers are still waiting to hear if they're going to make it through the courts to get asylum. The refugees we have here in the US are people who've been resettled from other countries and are come into the US already with refugee status and it's a path to citizenship, a legal path to citizenship. And for those people, we're seeing really interesting, there are many sort of NGOs that have emerged, community organizations, New Americans, for example, who are working with the government working with the municipality, I would say, to really help those refugees become integrated. And there are many of these community organizations that work with municipalities this way. And that is really a thing that we should support, I think.
Yeah, and so Canada, has this concept of welcoming cities, and
Yeah.
and I
Yeah,
think
exactly.
of the huge numbers of Ukrainians who went to Poland. I got several Polish American friends who were saying how proud they were of their home country for accepting all these Ukrainians.
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, the only problem with the Poland is that it was great that Ukrainians were the right color and the right religion.
Yeah,
Because earlier in the 2015 migration crisis in Europe, Poland was not so welcoming of refugees.
sure,
They were
sure.
different.
Yeah.
So
In fact, they see the Ukrainians as their brothers and sisters in.
exactly. That's another really important piece. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Look, we've got a few minutes and we've got another question. How do you see the impact of large influxes of refugees on cities' abilities to manage water and other wash issues?
Okay, so I'm very interested in this issue. Um, and this is what we were working on in Kampala. One of the things that really was apparent to me is, when I first began this, it seemed to me that when you see a massive influx of refugees, you're going to see these dramatic impacts on things like water and wash issues and all kinds of issues, especially around, things like services, urban services, education, health services, sanitation. It is very clear to me, and also to interviewing lots of people there, that these problems existed long before the refugees came. The refugees may aggravate the problems somewhat, and they may slightly move the needle, but they have not created these problems. Okay, now in the cities in towns where they outnumber the locals, probably they could well do that. But in most cases, they don't outnumber the locals, and the locals have done plenty for not taking care of the infrastructure. I don't blame the locals, I blame the governments. Not taking care of the infrastructure, allowing infrastructure to decay, not being able to keep up with the growth of the population. And we're even seeing this in Boston here. If anybody knows about looking under the underground at the pipes of water pipes in Boston, I'm sure you know very well that it's just a disaster waiting to happen. And so the same occurs elsewhere. The problems of infrastructure, poor policy, non-maintenance, when you have it stressed a little bit with people coming in, yeah, but those problems were not created by refugees, which is not to say there's not a problem that happens there now. But the media and others can bring it to light, especially politicians can bring it to light and blame it on refugees. That we're seeing a lot of everywhere.
Well, Karen, we're out of time. Just remains to say thank you for a fantastic talk. I have to get a copy of your book, and
Oh, do.
it really is it's a fascinating topic. And um, obviously, we're listening here from an urban planning point of view, and I know you've been working with Justin in the work that you did in Kampala. So, can we give a warm Cities at Tufts thank you to Karen Jacobsen?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you all.